Welcome to PRS in Conversation. I'm James Bubar. As a reminder, if you're new to the Philosophical Research Society channel, please subscribe. I'm incredibly honored to be joined by Dr. Hoeller, who has been a seminal force for decades in Gnostic thought and practice. Dr. Hoeller is the author of such important books as The Gnostic Jung and Gnosticism, New Light on the Ancient Tradition of Inner Knowing, and Freedom, Alchemy for a Voluntary Society. Along with numerous essays and articles, Dr. Hoeller has delivered thousands of lectures over the decades, including being one of two lecturers at the Philosophical Research Society, the other being Manly P. Hall, who will be our topic for tonight. Thank you so much, Dr. Hoeller, for taking time out of this pandemic to share your thoughts about Manly Hall and his continuing influence on wisdom seeking and on our culture. I'm honored to be talking with you today.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm always very happy to do whatever I can for Mr. Hall's Philosophical Research Society and for the memory of this giant spiritual and intellectual giant among men, whom it has been my privilege to serve and to work with for well over 20 years, namely Manly Palmer Hall. So I'm very grateful to you for doing this work.
Well, we're really grateful for your time and of all the lectures that you'll be doing, not only that you've done in the past, but you'll be doing upcoming at PRS. That certainly, even if they're via video, they're certainly well appreciated. And one thing different from maybe your time in the 20 years starting from the 70s is the global reach that PRS can have now with video streaming the lectures. So it's exciting to have you lecturing still at PRS.
Yes, well, that is, of course, there are new developments, and I am in many ways still very far back in history, and I value the fact that some people call me a Luddite.
Well, speaking of memories, if you wouldn't mind, it would be interesting to hear how you came to meet Manly Hall and maybe connected with PRS all those years ago. What started this amazing collaboration?
All right, I'll try to give a short synopsis. When I arrived in the United States early 1953, right around the New Year's of 53, I arrived in New York. My first residence was in the San Joaquin Valley, which in California, which I wasn't very happy with. I always refer to it as the California Siberia. But I soon got out of the Siberia and came to Los Angeles. Meanwhile, however, I was a newly baked official member of the Theosophical Society, and so I met various interesting American people by then. Among them was a Hungarian-born lady who owned a big farm in the San Joaquin Valley and who had a lot of beautiful books. And among them there were books by Manly Palmer Hall, especially his, what we refer to his big book, the Encyclopedic Outline, and some other of these beautiful folio-sized books that he had published. And I was very interested. My goodness, who is this man? And then when I got to Los Angeles, I learned that he was right here, not very far from where I resided. And so I got on the bus. I did not drive a car, and I still don't. On a Wednesday evening, which were Mr. Hall's weekday lectures, I went to the Philosophical Research Society to hear him. The large auditorium wasn't built yet. We were in the small auditorium upstairs. He came out from the library and sat down in a large chair. very unusual looking man, which may not strike everybody that much, but he had, as we subsequently learned after his death, he had no thyroid. His thyroid glands had been operated on when he was quite young, and so he was quite heavy in terms of his weight. But at the same time, he had the most beautiful chiseled facial features and the most beautiful hands, which looked like the hand of a piano virtuoso. And so he was there, and he gave a lecture which was by title about Blavatsky and her work, which of course was something I was very interested in. And so there we were. He sat down and he spoke without moving, without ever getting up, without shifting his position in the chair for more than 2.5 hours in a stretch.
Wow.
After which he looked at his watch and he said, "Oh, time is up," and finished. But I have no notes, never the slightest hesitation in his diction. It flowed out of him like a river of well-organized series of words. I have never before or after heard any speaker of such incredible talent. And when I left, I left sort of in an altered state of consciousness, having been subjected to that, and I said, well, now this is somebody I need to keep track of. And so then whenever it was possible for me, I would go to his Sunday lectures, which were also at that time held in a movie theater, because the large auditorium at the Philosophical Research Society was not constructed yet. But I went to many of them. And then the time came when a young and promising lecturer, a Dr. Douglas Lowe, whom I knew slightly, he was a recent graduate of USC, and a very philosophically minded gentleman who was the other lecturer besides Mr. Manly Hall. And this was close to 1970 by then.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Lowe all of a sudden passed away at his apartment in Ojai, California, while having the flu. Nobody expected him. So then Mr. Manly Hall's friend and vice president, Dr. Drake, called me and said that he heard good things about me. Would I be inclined to come and take over some lecture engagements because Dr. Lowe is dead? And that was just at the end of 1969 into 1970. And then I was hired by him and by Mr. Hall. I had a nice interview with Mr. Hall, and then I spoke there regularly, at least once a week, sometimes twice a week for over 20 years, which took me past even the demise of Mr. Manly Hall, and I was very, very happy with that venue. I lectured in other places too, but that was really through the 70s and into the early 80s. That was my principal engagement, and I was very, very happy there.
Well,
so that was kind of my, and of course now and then in between when I was there at the library or so, I would see Mr. Hall, and he'd call me into the office and we talk a little. I am not a celebrity seeker, and so I wouldn't just bulldoze my way in to see Manly Hall, but when there was something important to speak about, we had some very nice conversations. He was a polite, courtly gentleman of the first order, of the kind that you really don't find nowadays at all.
I think we could do a sequel to this talk just about what it would be like to interview with Mr. Hall for an hour. I think we could talk about that. That sounds like a pretty amazing experience to be sitting and having an interview.
Well, yeah, you could. I mean, it would take some work, but one could take excerpts from his writings and work them into a monologue and pretend that it's Mr. Hall speaking. That's an interesting project. You should work on that.
Yeah, I'm going to write that down. Yeah, give me a minute. Along the same lines, because it was a collaboration, as you mentioned, it extended past Mr. Hall's demise, but it was a little over 20 years, it seems like. And so I'm just curious, because so few people get to interact closely with people of that, not just intellectual genius, but that the ideas flowing from the source in such a way that he embodied. And in fact, you had mentioned that he wasn't just alive intellectually, but his eyes were alive to the things of life around him. And I'm just curious if you could take a couple minutes and talk about what that experience was like, collaborating and working with each other as the two lecturers at PRS.
Well, of course, obviously the lecture programs were quite separate, and Mr. Hall usually, every once in a while he would depart and have a two-part lecture or something of that sort, like his astrological lectures once a year and things like that. But other than that, his lectures were all individual lectures on individual topics. On Sundays and also on his weekday lectures. While I usually, as you may recall, when you were here, I usually gave series. I would start a series that would run a month or 6 weeks or something like that, dealing with a particular interrelated number of topics and then go on to another one. So our format was a little different, but I did model some of my speaking on Mr. Hall. That is where I learned that my lectures should be an hour and a half, because his usual lectures, his Sunday lectures, were an hour and a half. And so I would an hour and a half, and there were never any questions from the audience. Mr. Hall would not do that. I think he felt that he anticipated so many questions in the lecture itself that he did not need that, which was probably true. And so I would lecture for an hour and a half, and then I would get off the platform and maybe meet the people. And now and then, when Mr. Hall was prevented, sometimes he was a man in actually pretty good health. Since I knew him, right around the time when I met him, he had a double cataract operation, which in those days, around 1970, was a very painful and very serious thing. But other than, I think he had a gallbladder operation later on within that period, but he enjoyed really very good health. And so he was there, except in the summertime when he and Mrs. Hall, accompanied by another couple of friends of his, usually went for a couple of weeks to Japan. And in those times I would take up the slack and give his Sunday lectures as well as his weekday lectures. So we had a very pleasant, understanding relationship, and in that period of time, in problems arise of one kind or the other, and he always defended me, and when some problems came up from some quarters, then when we talked, he would sort of wink at me and say, "Oh yes, yeah, I understand. There is somebody there." There was somebody who was no longer around either, who didn't like me. Well, you know, that fellow just doesn't like you. But he would wink at me and says, "Yeah, well, you know, but you go on ahead. I am the one who makes the decisions."
Well,
he had a very subtle but very fine sense of humor also.
Wow. Well, I was just thinking, you mentioned Japan, and Dr. Hoeller, it's just amazing to me how prolific Manly Hall was, because he wrote, I think, over 100 books. But one of the books he wrote was on the antiquities dealer that he worked with in Japan, just from going over there all that time. And then he just writes a book about it. I'm sorry?
Mr. Nakamura, yes. Yes, and Mr. Nakamura was a real person.
Yeah.
And when Mr. Hall went to Japan for his vacation, then he always spent some time, I think mainly with Mr. Nakamura, buying various Japanese antiquities. And then after he and Mrs. Hall arrived, then a big wooden crate would be arriving from Japan. Wow. with the various items that he purchased. And he never let anybody else open up those crates. But he was there with somebody helping him. But he was there with a big hammer and opening up the crates, and just the supreme delight on his face as he picked out the various Japanese antiquities that he had added now to his collection. He was a good collector of many things. You know, the Theosophical Research Society still has quite a few of the rare books and rare objects that he collected, although some of it had been, I think, sold after his death.
Yeah, speaking of objects, I was just curious, because it's such a profound feeling whenever I encounter the statue out front that says, "Thou art that." Was that something that's been there a while, or how it came to PRS? Do you happen to know?
Yeah, there was a gentleman, friend, supporter of Mr. Hall, whose name I forget, and he wanted those. I think there are only 2 or 3 statues erected, and they were largely in the memory of an author whose name will probably come to me, a sort of theosophical author who was quite, Paul Brunton. Mm-hmm. So those were in honor of Paul Brunton, and had usually some saying that Paul Brunton used, and sometimes even one of the statues is a stack of books of Paul Brunton and then an Egyptian figure sitting on top. And that's how those they were donated to the society and to Mr. Hall by that gentleman in memory of Paul Brunton.
Wow, that's incredible. Thank you I've always wondered that, and I was already too busy thinking of other things after attending your lecture to remember to ask you then. So I'm glad I have the chance to ask you now. But getting to, we obviously don't have time to talk nearly enough about Mr. Hall's work, so his written work. So we'll just stick to the beginning, which I think is the best place to start, and it's his masterpiece that was published in 1928. And I'm gonna read the whole title, so you may want to relax for a minute or so. It may take a while. So it was published in 1928 under the title "Secret Teachings of All Ages: An Encyclopedic Outline of Masonic, Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and Rosicrucian Symbolic Philosophies, Allegories and Mysteries of All Ages." That's quite the title, and I'm just wondering if we
could. Quite the title.
Yeah, I think I'd be happy if I just wrote that. And I'm curious about if you just speak a little bit about its impact and maybe its continuing legacy.
Oh yeah, well, it's a magnificent source book. It's an absolutely unique creation, that particular book, and Mr. Hall himself was still quite young. And he sometimes would talk about it a little, saying that he felt that a reliable and well-produced and beautiful, aesthetically pleasing, large book, encompassing at least in outline form, the entirety of the esoteric tradition should be produced, and that such was not available. There were some profound seminal books of an esoteric nature available, like Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine, but they were of a completely different order. And so he put this together, and he said afterwards often, he said, ever since we published that book, I have written other books on paragraphs of that book. So I have put everything that I could, everything that I had available to me into that book. And undoubtedly that was the case. And he even used to tell some little circumstances, like there was a paraplegic gentleman whom he knew in San Francisco. I think he was a Freemason. And he was the one whom Mr. Hall commissioned to make the index to that big book. And the only way the gentleman could do it was lying in bed. Wow. And he made the index to that gigantic book while lying in bed. And Mr. Hall obviously was eternally grateful to him, because Mr. Hall felt that a good index was extremely important to any good book. In fact, his very words were that a book without an index is a fragment.
Wow. Well, that's the image of him writing the index lying in bed makes me think of Michelangelo painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel.
Yeah. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, yes. And then, of course, he knew this remarkable artist gentleman, J. Augustus Knapp, who in the latter years of his life lived in Laguna Beach. And I would sometimes meet him there. And he is the one who painted all the large plates, full-page plate illustrations in the big book as well. And he had a remarkable style, and I think that one can see that they were painted by somebody who really had a feeling for the subjects, and it wasn't just a painting,
Yeah,
and we had the originals at PRS, and when the 50th anniversary edition of the big book was published, Mr. Hall was still there. I have that book. I don't have an original edition, but at least I have two inscriptions in it. One which he did for every volume of the 50-year edition, and the other one to me personally. So I treasure that book very, very, very greatly. But we had an exhibit of the original prints I think quite a few of the original paintings of Mr. Knapp, and then the new ones. And I must say that with the improvement, I think, of photographic techniques or so, the paintings are more accurately reproduced in terms of color and all that in the 50th anniversary edition than they were in the original one.
Yeah, your description of his recognizing the need for this kind of book, it almost seems like that was a literal calling. I guess in the Campbell sense, a call into existence that, well, now he has to write it. But in this age of Google and Wikipedia, I can't help but wonder, he was working on it in the early 1920s, how did he write it in the sense of the resources he had to find or just the work involved in accumulating such a mass of information on the tradition?
Yeah, it's almost incredible. It almost seems like a superhuman
exactly.
task. But apparently from the little fragmentary statements that he would make now and then, a lot of it was done in libraries. And when he was quite young and was in New York before he moved out to the West Coast, he was at at one of the biggest libraries in New York. He was there every day. And then he also collected a lot of information by correspondence to experts in different parts of the world. And sometimes he got photocopies of pages from other works before. So it was a tremendous amount of research. But one can also see that it's not just a well-researched book, but it's also an inspired book, because the way it is organized and the main thesis of it being really that there was always an esoteric tradition in the world, East and West, and that it surfaced from time to time. It surfaced in the ancient mysteries, surfaced in Rosicrucianism, surfaced in Freemasonry. Modern times it surfaced in Theosophy, for instance, because he had great regard for Madame Blavatsky and the original Theosophical message. But to put these together and see the correspondences and the similarities and sort of the common esoteric intentionality in all of these embodiments, manifestations of the esoteric tradition, this strictly came from Manly Hall's intuition, which was superb.
Yeah, that's that inspired element that you're speaking of. And it's also commonly said about writers that they write the same book over and over again. But in Manly Hall's case, it's almost like he wrote one book. He wrote the masterpiece, and then as you mentioned, he just kept going into sections and digging and just producing this continual mining of the esoteric tradition.
That was definitely his own statement. What you just said might have come out of Mr. Hall's mouth itself, because that was his statement about his own work. And of course, one can sort of speculate historically, and I wasn't, even though I'm very old, I wasn't alive when he wrote that book. But let's say in the early part of the 20th century, there was a proliferation of teachers, books, various things having to do with esotericism. It was all very largely sort of sparked by Blavatsky before the turn of the century. But there were also various differences, and there was a lot of, let's say, inaccurate and cheap material that was being published. And so Mr. Hall, he actually said so from time to time, that his work in part was intended as a corrective to the vast proliferation of often really not very useful material of a literary nature that was on the market. So he tried to correct what was going on. He never said anything bad about anybody, but he certainly had a low opinion of quite a few authors in the field that wrote and published in the first half of the 20th century.
That's really interesting because not only is the masterpiece basically illuminating the golden thread you referred to going through the centuries of the tradition, but then it entered and infused the tradition that continued after it. And I was struck by one time you had mentioned that that interesting time in America of the 1920s and 30s, which
Oh yeah,
was kind of polarized between insane greed, financial speculation, that Gilded Age approach, and then the
yeah, yeah.
desperation of people seeking a way out that would often lead to a kind of consumer-oriented self-help wish fulfillment books. And
Yeah,
you
yeah.
doomed it a sense of what he concerned himself with by calling it spiritual materialism. And that seems to be a good entry into today's culture, in a sense, because you witness this frenzy with the stock market, even though millions of people are unemployed. And there's this proliferation all over media, not just in books, of things I think Manly Hall would see similarly problematic as some of the stuff that was around that he was correcting or being a
Oh yeah.
corrective to. And so I think
Oh
it may
yeah.
be a good way to talk about his, I guess, influence on today's America or our culture today. And do
Yeah,
you see
well,
that
of
similar
course,
connection?
yeah, of course, while tempora mutantur, as we used to say in Latin, times change, and we change with them. But even though there are, of course, changes and there are elements active and inactive in the culture that were not around in the 1920s or in the 1930s, but there certainly are some similarities. Maybe I'm just a pessimist, which a good Gnostic has to be to a certain extent, and I would say that there was actually more of a spiritual spark, even though mixed up with materialistic and as you say, selfish elements in the 20s and in the 30s and into the 40s. That is actually absent now. I think we are more impoverished in terms of teachings of that contain a real spiritual spark than our culture was in the early part of the 20th century. I think we are worse off, but that might be just my pessimism. But let's say when even those who are looking for material are looking for data rather than for ideas, and I think I think there has been a deterioration, especially at the widespread level, in the quality, both intellectual and spiritual, of the public. Now, that's my personal opinion. I don't know if Mr. Hall would agree, or if he agrees from the Empyrean realms where he is now, hopefully smoking his pipe. But I do think that there is an even more greater need for the sort of thing that Mr. Hall was doing, and for his heritage now than there ever was before.
Well, there definitely seems to be. We definitely seem to be awash in information over experience, and it reminds me of. I think you spoke about this, so I'll steal your idea if you don't mind. But in talking about Manly Hall, you had said his brilliance, besides the production coming from the source and the brilliance of his intellect, but was his ability to respect the combination of theory and practice in spiritual matters, and maybe that's where we're a little depleted by recognizing both.
That is certainly one area where we are very depleted. and to which I might add on other, and once again, these are my observations, that being that Mr. Hall very firmly believed in the need, in the consciousness of people, of whatever walk in life, of a transcendental, of a supernatural foundation of reality. He even says, you don't have to call it God, but it's been called that for a long time. It's the sort of thing that Carl Jung, for instance, meant when he told one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous that none of that work is going to succeed without the reference to a higher power. So let's say the higher power, the metaphysic of reality, was very, very important to him. He said that is the one on which you have to build, so to say, all the rest. And when that is not there, then the structure of your studies is likely to collapse like a house of cards. And I think that the secularization of the culture that has occurred, and that really reaches pretty deeply into people, I think has been a very unfortunate development, and one that Mr. Hall would deplore, I think, in a major fashion.
Yes, without that connection to the source, or as you're speaking, the metaphysical reality, without that grounding, we will suffer the maddening clamor of all of the whims of the day, whether they be ideologies or possessions or things or slogans, or just we're kind of in the winds without that deeper connection.
It's sort of a foundational issue. There again, I'm quoting my other favorite person, whom I had never met personally, although I saw him walking in the distance in Zurich one time, namely C.G. Jung, that there must be a foundation for the individual psychology, and that foundation is transcendental. One must be anchored in a deeper reality, and that seems to be so woefully lacking at the present time. You don't get the contact with that reality from Wikipedia, or you can get data, which some of the time are quite inaccurate. But you don't get the connection with the deeper reality, which is really what enlivens the whole situation. And that is a serious problem. However, again, we may have hope, because it seems that there never was a time in the history of the human race and whatever culture that could exist without something like religion. And Alan Watts was the one who said that. Yeah. And that without that metaphysical connection, things become insane. It's a pacifying and a sanitizing agency in the mind, and therefore, when it seems to be absent, that leaves a very, very big hole.
Yeah, and it seems like one of the travesties of today's age is what's happened to the word religion, because it tends to connote a fundamentalist dogmatism, and Alan Watts meant it in that sense of, connecting to greater things, not a particular strand.
Oh yeah, but of course there again, if one is somewhat thoughtful about these matters, religio just means reconnecting one with a deeper reality, and of course there have always been a myriad ways attempted to do that sort of thing, and in fact I think the rise of fundamentalism in various parts of the world are probably in large part owing to the absence of the mystical realizations which would be important and necessary. When mysticism departs, then a low type of fundamentalism prevails. And of course, it cannot substitute for what mysticism offers.
Yeah, there's no substitution for the source, as they say.
No.
And speaking of reconnecting or practice, which informs the foundation and hopes for following the tradition to the source, I want to talk a little bit about the PRS as a place, as an entity, because you had mentioned to me once that when Manly Hall passed, near when he passed, he wasn't sure that it would continue. And now about, 30 years after his passing, it is thriving, but I think it is re-thriving. I know there was, for several years, after he passed, it was a degree-granting institution. Now it's recently gone back to, I think, a more wide-open seeking place with a wide range of offerings for people. And so I was just curious about your thoughts on just the fact that it's still going on and that it seems to be undergoing a kind of spiral rebirth. It's not necessarily returning to the way it was, but it's coming back, but higher in some ways. So I like the image of a spiral.
Well, as much contact as I had with the reborn or being in the process of rebirth type of PRS, I think that is true. I think under its present leadership and the workers there who are really very devoted to the work and who are really they're really open to the spirit of the founder, which I think is extremely important and which was not really present for some time before this time. So it would seem that a rebirth is possible. But of course, again, one has to be aware of the difference in the differences in the culture and all the various factors which are now different. But I think the folks who are working at and for PRS are very well intentioned. They are trying to do the right thing, and that's why I offered the present president my services such as I can render at the age. I'm almost 89, because I thought I'm sort of the old relic. I am the relic that is there from the earlier period. But let's say I could sense that they were really doing that. Of course, there are challenges which are perhaps somewhat different from before and that are difficult to meet. See, Mr. Hall was the young genius in the 1920s and in the 1930s, and he attracted a tremendous amount of attention of esoterically and philosophically inclined people, and many of them had quite a bit of money. And so, while the society was never rich, it managed to be supported very largely because Manly Hall was there. So that, of course, is an entirely different situation now. And I would say that right now the danger to be invaded by really by the psychotic forces of the culture is very, very great. So if I had anything to say about it, I would stand there in a knight's armor with a huge sword in front of PRS, trying to defend it from the balderdash that is in the culture and that undoubtedly try to worm its way into that institution also.
Well,
because we are really living in a crazy period, my friend.
Yeah, and also a lot of economic dislocation, and this may be a good place to remind our listeners that one thing different about today's PRS is its national and international and global reach, and that they do ship books all over the world, so people can support PRS by going online to the bookstore. They're also accepting donations, and they are doing using that to keep programming going, but also supporting outreach around the community and helping support scholars, thinkers, readers, writers who can add to the community. And we're excited that you'll be again lecturing, hopefully in August, but maybe via video. But I think that will still be really, really appreciated. I know I'm looking forward to it.
Well, those of us who've been attracted to the fire, as the Gospel of Thomas would put it, we are still there, and we are still warming our hands and our spirits by the fire that was kindled by the great man, and try to go into the future, maybe in some ways obviously differently, but still in his spirit, and that I think is very, very important.
Yeah, we're all caretakers of the sacred fire, as you've often said.
Indeed.
Well, I just wanted to close with a story, and I hope it doesn't embarrass you, but I have to share it. I'm actually stealing your story and retelling it to you because it made such a big impression on me when I heard it 20-something years ago. And you were talking about waiting in line. I think this was the early 1970s, and you were paying a utility bill. I guess you could do that back then. You could wait in line. I think you even mentioned you were waiting till the end of the month, and you were waiting in line, and you were reading. And you were reading.
Yes, you're right. I often did that. Yes.
Yeah, and you were reading the J.R.R. Tolkien's works for the first time, and standing in line in the long line, as we could imagine in L.A. And a gentleman stopped by you and asked you, "First time?" Meaning, is it the first time you're reading this Tolkien book? And you said yes. And then he said, and I'll try to get the quote correctly, he said, "Oh, how I envy you." And he walked away.
Yes, that is really pretty much what happened. And he had tears in his eyes.
Wow.
He wished so much that he could read the book for the first time. Now, after about my 11th reading of the trilogy, by which I am at now, I could have told him that, don't be concerned so much about that, but read it again, because every time you will find more treasures, which is what one does. But I, of course, fully understood the spirit of his statement. Yes, I very well remember that.
Yeah, and you also had mentioned a worker going to the Oxford Library and coming across I forget which college it's in, and coming across the bust of Tolkien and saying, "Well done, Mr. Tolkien, well done." And he had all of his tools named after Tolkien characters. So when I was when I was on the Oxford,
there was a statue. There's a statue, a bust of Tolkien there, I believe. I have not been there, and he grabbed the shoulder of the statue and said, "Well done, Professor, you have given us a wonderful yarn." And he kept patting the statue on its back.
Well, I went to Oxford a few years ago, and my friend said, "Is there anything you want to see?" And I said, "Well, besides the Great Blackwell's bookstore," I said, "we have to find this bust." and it's not a huge statue. So I went all over Oxford looking for it, and then I found it, and I said, "Well done, Mr. Tolkien," and people looked at me rather strange. But I bring up that story because I think the same thing can be true of the works of Manly Hall. How I envy the people who have not yet read them, but as you just mentioned about Tolkien, after the 11th reading of the trilogy, it only gets better. So to reread Manly Hall is also quite a treat. And Dr. Heller, the same applies to your work, especially the Freedom and the other book I mentioned on Gnosticism, a new light on the ancient. God, I'm messing up your title. I'm sorry. It's getting late here in Izmir.
Well, probably the Gnostic Gospels and things of that sort on the various names. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking specifically on your book, the new light on the ancient tradition of inner knowing, and I just wanted to let you know that I feel the same way about your work that man felt about Tolkien when he talked to you. And I whenever someone encounters your work for the first time, I say how I envy you, and I also look forward to rereading. So I want to thank you for all those words you've channeled from your seeking and your experience and your practice all these years. They have shaped so many lives. I want to thank you for all of the years of dedication to PRS. I wish we could be together sharing some wine and some food. But today I really want to thank you for all that you have done for so many, for PRS, and for everyone who's still waiting to encounter your work.
Well, I am somewhat speechless and somewhat moved by all these thanks, but let's put it that way. I know that they come from a sincere and true place, and I accept them. I only wish that I could have done more, and inasmuch I'm still walking around in the midst of the epidemic, I hope and pray that I will be able to do more and to be even closer to Mr. Hall and to his heritage and to the PRS as well.
Well, speaking of more...
Thank you so very much for this interview.
Well, thank you for your time. And speaking of more, we hope to see you on the YouTube channel at least, but maybe in person as well at PRS in August. For those of you who are new to the channel, please remember to sign up, subscribe, and you can visit prs.org to sign up for email updates. And you can learn a lot more about Dr. Heller and Gnosticism through the amazingly resourceful gnosis.org website. Thank you very much, Dr. Heller.
Thank you very much.
Please take good care.
Good, thank you.